Good evening. I'm Michael Popa, Executive Director of Mainstream Coalition, and on behalf of our Board of Directors, committees, and staff, thank you so much for joining us for this month's members-only discussion. And thank you for choosing to be a Mainstream member. Your engagement helps to support our mission to empower Kansans to make their government more representative and responsive through informed participation and meaningful action. Every 10 years after the US Census results are tallied, states engage in redistricting processes at both the federal and state levels. The results determine who represents which constituents. The aim is to ensure that the people are well represented by their elected officials, but the process is undeniably political. Tonight, we'll explore with our guests the nuts and bolts of redistricting in Kansas and also the effects that politics has on the process, and we'll discuss the possible outcomes. We are offering closed caption through a third-party provider this evening. If you don't see it, please click the CC button on the bottom of your screen. Should be about there. If you're on a mobile phone or iPad or tablet, it might be in a different position. You might have to swipe left or right or hit the more button, and just make sure you click show subtitles. I do apologize to our guests this evening and everyone attending. The closed captioning is correct about 85% of the time. We also have a Q&A feature that we're using tonight that again is going to be located if you're on a desktop at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question for one of our panelists, please feel free to enter it there. And now I'd like to invite our moderator on screen, President of the Mainstream Coalition Board of Directors, Mr. Larry Meeker. Hi, Larry.
Hi there.
How are you doing tonight, sir?
I'm doing well. Good evening to you.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you. Glad you could be with us tonight. And how about we do a quick poll of the audience just to kind of see where everybody is in their knowledge of the redistricting process. Ready to launch that?
Let's see where people stand.
All right. So 3 quick questions, folks. Go ahead and choose the answer that best defines where you are. And Larry, we should be able to see those as they come in.
Okay, I'm looking.
All right, so far it looks like
Progressives and moderates.
yeah, progressives, moderates. If you look at that, which best defines your understanding of the redistricting process, it looks like we're leaning heavy on I could hold my own in a conversation, and redistricting is pretty new to me.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's good. We have 3 experts so far. We have 4% that says they know everything there is to know about redistricting, and they should have asked to be on the panel. So I apologize you were not asked, but if you email me, we'll get you on. We might be able to get you on something in the future. All right. Well,
all right.
I'll share those results with everyone, and everyone should be able to see them and scroll through to see them yourself. So you know I wasn't lying.
Looks good. Looks good.
All right. Well, I will jump off now, Larry. Have a wonderful panel discussion with our amazing panelists.
We will, and we'll be back with you later in the evening.
Sounds great.
Thank you, Michael, and good evening, everyone. If you're like me, I suspect most of you have wondered from time to time, perhaps more frequently with increasing frequency, as to why things with massive public support never get acted into legislation. We've had so much massive gun violence that the thoughts and prayers has become a trite statement that many of us have become too accustomed to. And yet even the polls will show massive numbers of people, large majorities of the American population would like at least some moderate gun reform laws. And yet even NRA members, and yet that doesn't seem to happen. In Kansas, there's broad support for Medicaid expansion, something that would be of great benefit to rural communities, something that would boost those economies a bit and provide needed medical care, yet it doesn't happen. And in the midst of a pandemic, our ingenuity as a nation has been able to show us our ability to develop a vaccine, but politically, we have fallen short in delivering that vaccine and getting acceptance of it to the public. Why does this happen? And I think there's one simple, very simple, quite frankly, answer to that. And that is, we are not a democracy. The United States is not a democracy. We're a republic. And I think most of us may intuitively know that. Many of us have experienced at least a couple of elections where the person who got the most votes in the presidential election didn't win the election. However, I think looking back, our founders never really intended us to be a democracy. A lot of compromises were made, a lot of negotiating took place to simply help us become a union of states, a federal government, as opposed to a confederacy. And while our founder talked about all men being created equal, they did so, owning slaves, and they really meant men, women had no voice. That's not to sell short our founders, because at the time, this was the most progressive form of government, the only one which had ever even created all white men and thought of them as being equal. You look at our Senate and House of Representatives. I did a little math here the other day. We have 7 states in the United States who have only 1 US representative. That means those 7 states have 2% voice in the House of Representatives, but 14% of the voice in the United States Senate. Those 7 states have 1/7 the population of California. The idea of unequal powers in our votes didn't end when we formed the government. It continued on and continues on today. The Missouri Compromise was done to make sure that when we brought in a slave state of Missouri, Maine could come in then as a free state. And anyone would be naive, I think, today to consider admission to statehood for Washington, D.C., or even Puerto Rico not being a political question. Hence, we are not, in some sense, the beacon of democracy I think we often think we are. The Economic Intelligence Union of Freedom House, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that ranks countries across the globe, puts us at number 25 in the form of democracy. And in 2019, they moved us from a, quote, full democracy to a, quote, flawed democracy, largely because of pressures on electoral integrity, weakening safeguards against corruption, and a weakening judicial system of independence. But I think we must also remember that our goal was a more perfect union, and we continue to pursue that. And redistricting is one of those issues that help us perhaps bring the wishes of the broad public better in line with the legislation and the governance we have, or it can drive a bigger wedge between the two. And tonight we have a distinguished panel to help walk our way through that particular issue. Our first panelist this evening is Kansas Senator David Haley. Senator Haley is a Kansas City, Kansas native representing the 4th District in Wyandotte County. He has been in the Kansas legislature for 27 years, serving 6 years in the House and 21 years in the Kansas Senate. He serves on several committees, including the Judiciary Committee, the Joint Committee on State-Tribal Relations, and as ranking minority leader on ethics, elections, and local government. Senator Haley, please give us a few comments. You've been there a long time and obviously had a chance to see this process work out more than once. You're muted. Senator Haley is muted. We need to get I can't hear you yet. No.
Looks like we're having some technical difficulties. Why don't we skip to the next panelist while we get Senator Haley's audio figured out?
Okay, we'll get Senator Haley's audio figured out. Our next panelist is Professor Dagney Velasquez. Dagny is a math professor at Kansas City, Kansas Community College, and since attending a gerrymandering conference at Tufts University in 2017, she's become very interested in the math of redistricting and its social and political impact. Last year, she served on Kansas City's Complete Court Count Committee in an effort to promote a complete 2020 census count for our region, the first building block of fair districting. Dagny, you take it away.
Thanks, Larry. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Fine.
Good. Well, I just want to give a brief intro into what gerrymandering is, what it looks like, and how to do it. So, actually, I want to start from, let's see. So quick definition, gerrymandering simply means manipulating the boundaries of districts to favor a party or a class, and by doing that, diluting the vote of another party, class, or group of people. So this is, I guess, the downside of redistricting is that gerrymandering is what has got a lot of news lately. People are trying to fight against gerrymandering happening. There are some legal guidelines for redistricting. A couple come from the federal side, the federal laws, and there's just a couple of laws there. One is that districts have to be equal in their size, population-wise. So it's roughly the same number of people in each district. And when redistricting happens, it can't discriminate on the basis of race. So that's what the federal laws say. A lot of states adopt other policies. So like in Kansas, they say that districts have to be what they call compact. Now there's a lot of arguing about what compact really means. The intention is we don't have long, squiggly kind of looking districts where maybe one person can be 100 miles away from another person. So they're supposed to be as compact as possible if you look at it. Contiguous, meaning if you were to draw, if you were to trace the boundaries of a district with your pencil, you get all the way around the boundaries without picking up your pencil. They should preserve political subdivisions as much as possible, meaning don't divide up towns and counties if you don't have to, and preserving communities of interest. What's interesting is, though, there's no federal or state law that prohibits gerrymandering, partisan gerrymandering. So gerrymandering to favor one party or another. Currently, that's allowed and even expected. So how do you go about drawing the districts to favor a party? I'm going to give a very kind of simplified example of how that could happen. We have this perfectly rectangular state, say, where 60% of the precincts in this state vote blue and 40% of them vote red. And we're going to divide this state up into 5 different districts. And there's 3 different ways here that we could divide up the districts. And the first example we have here, 5 different districts, they are compact, they're contiguous, they look very nice and simple. But the problem here is all 5 of them are majority blue. And so you would have 100% of the representation would be blue, whereas only 60% of the people vote blue. So that wouldn't be fair to the red precincts to have 100% of the representation be blue. It could be divided up the second way, and you see we have just kind of some funny looking shapes here, not quite as compact. And what's happened is these 5 districts pack as many blue as possible into 2 of the districts, and then the rest of the blue are cracked among the remaining 3. And the result is that 3 of the 5 districts are majority red and only 2 are majority blue. And so what we would have is 60% of the representation in this state would be red, which also doesn't seem fair because 60% of the people voted blue. And so we have a real imbalance there. This third example here, 5 districts again, they are pretty compact, same number of people. And now we have 3 districts that are blue, 2 are red. So 60% of the representation would be blue, 40% red. So we have proportionality here at least. So now the representation actually looks like, it looks like what the voting percentages were, but it's also not perfect, because if you can see here, we've lost what's known as competitiveness. Okay, so when you have districts where everyone looks the same, some would argue you lose some accountability. Your representatives lose some accountability because there's no real competition in those districts anymore. So maybe also not a perfect solution, but at least proportional, it reflects the voters better than the other two plans. If we look at the state districts in Kansas, here they are, you can see that the smaller geographical districts we have in the more urban areas, and where it's less populated, it's going to be, of course, a bigger geographical area to get the same population in there. Whether they're compact or not, people could argue. The mathematicians love to argue about how to measure compactness and what the standard for compactness should be, and we have not yet come to a consensus, I'm afraid to say. But what does proportionality look like? Well, if things were perfectly proportional, if you have this graph where our x-axis here is how people voted, and the y-axis would be the result for representation. So in a perfectly proportional kind of setting, if 50% of the people voted one way, then 50% of the representation would reflect that. 60% vote this way, then 60% would be represented. What's the situation in Kansas? I took the voting data from the last few votes and extrapolated from that data. This is what the line looks like in Kansas. So you can see if 50% of the people in Kansas voted for a Republican state representative, we would have about 60% of the representatives would end up being Republican because of the way that the district lines are drawn. So we don't have perfect proportionality in Kansas. Some people argue this is a problem. Some would say, well, it's kind of what's to be expected. But this is the reality that we're dealing with in Kansas. We don't have perfect proportionality. I'm gonna skip over a couple of these and just kind of get to, well, how can we participate in the redistricting process? There are a couple of tools that are out there. One that I really like, the Metric Geometry and Gerrymandering group has created free software that's online that anyone can use, and they've loaded all of the last census data. We don't have the newest census data in there yet, but they load that in there. Anyone can draw a districting map according to what they think is fair, and see if you can get the legislatures to listen to it. But the two big things that I would say is to support legislation that is trying to establish a nonpartisan commission for redistricting, kind of take it out of the hands of those who are naturally going to be partisan, and also support legislation that would require some public feedback and participation in the process. So very quick intro into gerrymandering there.
Okay. Senator Haley, are you on yet? I guess if you're not, let's go on to Cole Fine. Cole Fine is from Olathe, Kansas, and recently wrapped up a campaign for the Kansas House of Representatives. He fell short. I know the feeling. I've been there, done that myself. But he maintains a steadfast interest in improving government beyond party lines. Cole works as a nonprofit consultant and helped form the Fair Maps Fund and an advocacy group pushing for fair redistricting in Kansas and Texas. Cole's a graduate at the University of Central Missouri with a BA concentrated in public law and theory. Cole.
All right, thank you. And is sound good? Everyone can hear me?
I don't know if it's working. I still don't know if it's working.
Oh, is that Senator Haley in the background? I think so. All right, well, I'm gonna jump into my presentation and let's see if I can get this going here. All right, so we're going to talk through the courts. The courts are a very complex topic as far as redistricting goes. I am not an attorney, so please do not take this as any legal advice. And I should be able to answer most of your questions, but I'm also happy to redirect your questions to some of the legal experts I'm working with and folks who have direct experience litigating redistricting. So these are the different types of court. Courts can be a dry subject, so I threw in some humor here. I can't see all your faces, so I hope you're laughing at my hilarious sense of humor. We're going to be talking about a handful of courts, most notably U.S. District Court and Kansas Supreme Court. There could be, U.S. Supreme Court could be on here. That is a possible destination, as well as some other local Kansas courts. So I want to start by jumping into 2012 redistricting. I am sure you have heard of the 2012 lawsuit, or the Chris Kobach redistricting, or the district court drawing the maps. And so I want to talk through that very briefly. The year was 2012. For my Chiefs fans out there, that is Matt Castle. So it has been a long time since this occurred. The Kansas legislature is drawing maps, as they are going to be doing in 2022. Moderate Republicans and conservative Republicans were in this infighting where, the conservative Republicans wanted to gerrymander, moderate Republicans were sticking to their guns. And it was going nowhere fast. In order to pass the legislature, it has to pass the House, the Senate, and the governor, and then the Supreme Court must affirm. So this infighting between moderate and conservative Republicans was really just tying up the maps. It couldn't get passed. They would change things around. It would still get stuck. And so finally, we were running out of time. The elections were coming up. And so an individual in Kansas pushed this to U.S. District Court on grounds of, hey, the election is coming up. I don't know what district I live in. Nobody knows what district they live in. We're running out of time. And so the U.S. District Court was open to hearing the case, and they sent this to Chris Kobach's office to see, what he wanted to do as the defendant. Chris Kobach was actually on board with this. It was becoming more and more clear that the maps in 2012 were not going to get through the Kansas legislature. And that would be a very big legal issue. There's going to be, you have to have maps in order to hold an election. And so we're going to talk through some of the things the court ruled when they drew these maps. One word to remember is precedent. When a court rules on something, they form a precedent. So, when the Supreme Court ruled that gay marriage is legal, that set the precedent that now you can get married as a gay individual. So some of the quotes here, this is the first one I found interesting. The court said, as judges, we do not tread unreservedly into this political thicket. The court has no interest in intervening in redistricting. They got interested because it was more of a constitutional issue. You have to have maps that are representative of you as you are either running for office or voting. And the legislature wasn't putting any maps out, and so this became a constitutional issue. Your 14th Amendment rights are that you will have fair districts, and the state must provide those to you. And so this kind of conveys that the court had no interest in the process, but they had to get involved for constitutional reasons. This is another quote. Particularly the bold parts are things that are really important to 2022. The court stated in their opinion that the entirety of Johnson and Wyandotte counties should be included in the 3rd district. They have formed the core of the 3rd district for decades. This is talking about the federal district. This is where Sharice Davids now currently represents. This quote can more than likely be applied in some sort of court this coming year. And then the court goes on to say that these districts represent the greater Kansas City area, a major socioeconomic unit. So the court views the way the district is currently made up to be a, quote, socioeconomic unit. And there is obviously discussion of slicing this district into two, which this particular panel would not agree with. They also mentioned the standard deviation of state versus federal court. The standard deviation is higher at state level. So if you worked at Pizza Hut and you were asked to put 50 pepperonis on every pizza, if you put 47 on one or 51 on the next, no one would really ask any questions. But the closer you get to putting 12 pepperonis on a pizza, someone will start to get a little curious what's going on there. And that's your standard deviation. A high standard deviation means you're putting 5 pepperonis on a pizza or 200. And so the state level, you can actually have higher standard deviation to protect communities of interest, while Sharice Davids and the other. It's always a good Zoom call when your dogs start barking. So Sharice Davids or another individual have to be in districts that are so concise that it's 1 or 2 individuals. So jumping into the next here, this is actually Senator Haley's district, which I will let him talk more about, but the court viewed that his particular, hold on one moment, that his particular district preserved a specific purpose, which was the racial makeup of District 4. District 38 was also mentioned there. All right, so can maps end up in district court again? Yes, but not because of a Republican gerrymander. There was a federal or a US Supreme Court case in 2019 that made partisan gerrymandering a topic that federal court cannot handle. There are other forms of gerrymandering. There's racial gerrymandering, and the federal court can still rule on that. So we could see this ending up in federal court for racial gerrymandering, but more than anything, this will likely end up in some form of federal court because of time constraints. With COVID, we're already limited in our time, and the filing deadline is June 1st. End of session is April 21st of 2022. Unless there's a special session called, when time runs out, and then it becomes a constitutional issue, and you could start to see federal court involved. So the most likely scenario is if something gets held up in the legislature, it heads off to federal court, and then that's when, and when you have that filing deadline coming up, you don't know what district you live in, that's when it could end up in federal court. Kansas Supreme Court, all maps must end up here. If it is passed by the legislature, it must end up in federal or in Kansas Supreme Court. They rule on the state House and the state Senate districts. They do not rule on the four federal districts. And so that is of note because of the potential gerrymandering at the federal level. The state Supreme Court is made up of 7 justices selected by a 9-person panel. Here are the sitting justices by the governor that granted them confirmation. These numbers are a little skewed because the nominating committee isn't necessarily the same, the same ideological or philosophical views of the governor themselves, but there are 5 appointments from Democratic governors and 2 from Republican governors. As I mentioned, they only rule on state House and state Senate districts, so they can send legislative districts back to the legislature, but they cannot send the 4 federal districts back to the legislature. I'm going to skip over this. Other state courts could be involved. There's a very complex legal hurdle there, but other state level courts could actually rule on federal redistricting, but really complex. And so the bottom line is we don't know what to expect from the courts. The tricky thing is every court case regarding redistricting from 2012 to 2021 hasn't been applied yet because redistricting only happens every 10 years. So there's been nothing to test it out on, if you will. All these rulings on court cases haven't been able to be applied to any particular redistricting efforts. So, we could see the courts be very involved and really take a stand against the Supreme Court ruling, or we could see minimal interjection. There's really not a great feel for what's going to happen in the courts. I laid out some scenarios here. I don't have a great feel either for what to expect. I think one of the neutral scenarios is probably going to be what we see, some sort of gridlock where either the governor sends stuff back, the court sends stuff back, and before you know it, we're out of time. And then you have a 14th Amendment issue, and you've got to have maps ready to go by the end of the session. And that's when it becomes a US Constitution issue, and you can see some courts start to step in. That is all I have, and I will gladly send it back to Larry.
Okay. I think this is a good time. Senator Haley, I think you're on now. This is a good time for you to jump in. You've just been mentioned in your District 4.
Let's certainly hope. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you.
I can. All right, Larry, thank you. And thank you for helping with the technical difficulties and getting them through. Certainly, let me first say to you and to Michael Papa and to Mainstream, what an honor really it is for me to join you and to be a part of this discussion on redistricting. As the Dean of the Senate now, or so they say, having the longest tenured anyway, it's refreshing. And I appreciate so much the overview and the direction that Cole and Connie gave, as I do your intro, Larry, and to remind us of where we have been in this process of redistricting, to remind us of the contentious time that it is going to be for us, and hopefully to find some way with the advocacy and the insight that have been provided to talk about what we can do to prepare for what's going to happen in the next 12 months. As has been mentioned, I was pleased to be on redistricting twice, first in the House and then in the Senate, actually the Senate twice before, and to be on the committee. We've talked about many things, and it's funny that our now Attorney General, Derek Schmidt, when he was Majority Leader in the Senate, was an advocate for having the something done by the statistics of the census. In other words, something that's generated by something other than the legislative turmoil that we have there. Schmidt was a big proponent of having that independent, which many states have turned to draw this process. And now I imagine remain pretty mute during the ensuing 12 months, which is a shame. I think that he has the opportunity to remember that from which he comes and to continue to be a part of equity and fairness and ensuring that districts maintain their integrity and that they represent, as is intended, the greater slice of Kansas by way of population. Yes, the 4th district, which I'm pleased and honored to represent in Wyandotte County, was a flashpoint, as was mentioned by Cole. And I don't think it's going to be as much of a concern, optimistically, this go around, nor will the 38th. 38th is out of out of Garden City in Western Wyandotte County. Only because the shifts are such that if the ethnicity for the 4th district were to go instead of east-west, but to change it to go north-south, it would still be predominantly Democratic. That too can be said in the 38th, which is represented by John Dahl. Because of the ethnic shift, primarily that shift being within the Latino population in his district. So this is where we turn. This is the question. This is, and by the way, I have learned as much. I don't know what percentage said that they could have been on this panel and spoken to redistricting, because certainly you could have taken my spot, because I've learned so much through it myself. So definitely, I'm not one of the 4% that should be on the panel. I think the previous conferees or those that have brought this discussion here today are. But I do know a little bit about advocacy, and I do feel that this is the time. Certainly, we're well armed. We're not going to have an independent commission, or they would have gotten that into the works already. There'll be some talk of it, especially when we look at what some or those few other states that have adopted doing that commission have done. But I do think that as we look at where those new districts will be, certainly the population shifts that we have in our state are going to ensure that there'll be several House districts that will increase in Johnson County and maybe a Senate district. And by the way, if I'm repeating something that was said, I had to block out for a while and resume back in due to the technical difficulties. So if this has been covered already, I apologize. But looking ahead, though, we're looking at where those populations will be and how we can put our advocacies in place to ensure that they have, yes, progressive, moderate, and even for those that identify otherwise, that there's cohesion as a community of interest. The courts protect communities of interest primarily on those standards that we can look to and readily understand, like race or ethnicity, or sometimes even income. Income has been upheld to be a particular community of interest to a certain extent. They don't want to dilute those that are in different areas of income division. In some areas that has been upheld. There's been some discussion as to how my district might run very narrowly, starting in Wyandotte County and progressing westward, perhaps even into another county. And I know I don't want to deny the antecedent where I said that we aren't concerned about what the court will uphold and what they won't regarding the 4th Senate District, my own, and the 38th, Senator John Dahl out from Garden City centrally. But what it will be used by when we're looking at the new districts that will be drawn will be leverage, I suspect and contend. It will be leverage to say that, well, you failed us in allowing us to more properly put a community of interest in 2 or 3, actually there are 2 other districts as well besides the 38th and the 4th that will fall into the category, roughly 10% of our 40-member Senate. So now we have to shift or be allowed to shift to do some things that may not be as favorable in these new districts. And I say primarily, not only Johnson County, but surrounding counties as they try to draw in more of the ideology that has led us into, honestly, this morass of social and progressive thought, which is certainly very strenuous in their ability to define and to promote policy and legislation. So how do advocates react? What do advocates do? Where does mainstream play a crucial role in that? These are questions that obviously I can't answer alone. It is something that I appreciate we can hopefully look at. You've got some tremendous talent, not only at mainstream, but certainly I see many advocates who are on the Zoom today who've been through this process as well. We can ill afford to lose these crucial drawing of districts if we are to keep Kansas from being a continued laughingstock for many of the policies that are being developed and promulgated for the next decade. I have served longer now after we lost our leadership last year, Senator Hensley, than anyone in the Kansas Senate, a term longer than anyone. And I've never seen it really worse. I thought we went through some rough times with during the Brownback administration, the rise and ultimate fall of COBA, previously the Phil Klein era. And I remember Susan Wagle as president of the Senate, and arch conservatism. It has never been more bleak, honestly, than it has now, despite all of that. And we cannot rest on the laurels of the expectation with what we need to do to ensure that we maintain common sense to keep Kansas from not being late night talk fodder and to fall into the trap of being anything less than the beloved state that we're in. So I don't know the answer to that question, because if these districts are in place throughout the 2020s and early into the 2030s, and if the mindset continues to prevail that is so regressive, that its leadership will continue, I think we diminish our future. I think we diminish the prospect of our population growing. We may drop to 3 congressional districts next time as people continue to move away from our beloved state and have no reason to come back because of the regressive, the very regressive tone that has been struck and that is prevailing. So
hopefully we can get some redistricting in here that will, as we draw new lines, that will help us move beyond that.
yes, indeed. Thank you, Larry. And I hope we get a chance to have some Q&A.
Oh, we will. We've got plenty of time set aside for that, and I look forward to hearing your comments there.
Great.
Our
Thank you.
final panelist is Connie Taylor. Connie has a passion for voting, voting rights, and voter engagement. She joined the League of Women Voters of Johnson County in 2019 and currently serves as the League's people-powered Fair Maps champion. She has volunteered for several organizations and has served on the boards of directors for nonprofits in California, Nebraska, and Kansas. I find that an interesting group of states. Taylor holds a master's degree in public administration from the University of Kansas. She lives in southern Johnson County with her husband, Jeff, and their 12-year-old corgi. All right, Connie, take it away.
Thank you, Larry and Mainstream Coalition, for this opportunity to share with you the League's work in redistricting. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan grassroots organization founded more than 100 years ago to engage and empower voters. And the League's people-powered Fair Maps is a multi-year redistricting campaign for the purpose of ensuring that every voice is heard with a fair and transparent process that eliminates partisan and racial gerrymandering, giving people the power with the redistricting process. Voters choose their representatives instead of representatives choosing their voters. The first phase of this people-powered Fair Maps campaign included a nationwide effort to encourage people to respond to the census so that the count would be accurate. And for the second phase in Kansas, the League will focus on civic education and engagement. And leagues in Kansas set aside an entire week of activities to kick off this portion. We begin the week on April 24th with our virtual state convention and conclude with a panel discussion on April 29th via Zoom. All events are open to the public, and detailed information and registration links are available on our websites. And I'll drop that link in the chat at the conclusion of my presentation. After our week of action, we'll focus our efforts on reaching out to our community partners like Mainstream Coalition to talk about redistricting and ways people can get involved. The League also wants to help our organizations identify their community of interest and ways to map them. In public hearings, these maps will help facilitate testimony and testifying on how you want your district drawn. So how can you engage in the League's work? Join the League. Continue to learn about redistricting, fair representation, and communities of interest. Engage other organizations as well as your friends and your neighbors about those topics. Write your elected officials. Send your maps of your community of interest. Attend those public hearings and meetings about redistricting. Testify at them. Tell your elected officials how your current districts impact you and your community, where your communities of interest are located and what connects you, and the difficulty you and your neighbors have had with current or past districts, and especially in terms of making your voices heard. So what does it mean when we talk about fair maps or fair redistricting? Virginia Case, who is the CEO from the League of Women Voters at the national level, said this: making sure that people feel their votes matter. That's what we hear from people all over the country. Because of the way maps are cracked or packed, people squashed together, many voters are not represented fairly. The League's position on redistricting is that we want a process with enforceable standards that promote fair and effective representation at all levels of government with the maximum opportunity for public participation. We support the one person, one vote principle, and we hold that fair representation requires districts to be contiguous, eliminates partisan gerrymandering, preserves those communities of interest, splits as few cities and counties as possible. The League recognizes that compactness and political competitiveness may also be considered, but we place those two criteria below the others in order of priority. The League rejects the notion that redistricting should protect incumbents by considering the incumbent's address or giving preferential treatment for a political party by considering party affiliation, voting history, or candidate address. 10 years ago, the legislature's joint special committee on redistricting held public meetings in 14 cities across Kansas. The League of Women Voters presented testimony at 4 of those meetings. And these public meetings are an opportunity for you to make the committee aware of your concerns for your community. So Senator talked a little bit about communities of interest. They're described in the redistricting guidelines in the past, and they're often vague. They're best understood where they are on a map, along with a description of those shared interests of the population. So for example, a congressional district covers large areas of the state, and a community of interest may be defined in terms of entire counties or regions. And in the case of House and Senate districts, a community of interest may be as small as a neighborhood, a grade school attendance area, or even an area defined by a natural or infrastructure boundary, such as a river, highway, or railroad. Other communities of interest may be connected in terms of a neighborhood improvement area or school districts. Informing elected officials about existing communities of interest and how they might be impacted by redistricting is an important aspect of public input in this process. And the League can assist mainstream coalition members and others about identifying and mapping your community of interest. The League encourages leaguers and partners alike to contact your legislators to urge them to establish, adopt, and make public the guidelines and criteria that will be used in redistricting as soon as possible. Ask that the public provide input to those guidelines and the criteria so that it sets the stage for the fairest maps possible. The League would like to see the legislature adopt a schedule for considering and enacting redistricting plans, leaving ample time for the Kansas Supreme Court to review them in preparation for the 2022 election cycle. We'd like to see plans for the 2021 summer and fall redistricting activities to be held both virtually and in person to maximize participation. And we'd like to see these plans made public no later than June. We'd also like to see that the plan is posted, easily accessible, and updated as necessary. The League would also like to see a process and timelines for the public to submit their own district maps, as well as community of interest maps, and in what format, whether it's paper, electronic, or a written description. So be sure and talk to your neighbors and your friends about their representation, and be sure they know about opportunities to participate. So the 4 things I want you to remember: their week of action that's coming up April 24th through 29th. Talk to your legislators, contact the League for help drawing maps, and continue to check on our websites for updated information. And thank you for this opportunity to share about the League of Women Voters and People-Powered Fair Maps.
Thank you, Connie. I'd like to start off with a question. It was mentioned, and the very basis of all of this redistricting is the census. That's where you start. That's what kicks off this process. Do each of you feel like we got a good census count this last time? And does allocation of prison population or student populations have any major effect on our districting? Professor Velasquez, you may be the right one to start on that.
I would say our census was not as good as we wanted, but probably as good as the last one. We knew what the hard to reach communities were, and we had a lot of plans in place to really reach out to those communities and improve the turnout for the census. And most of those plans, unfortunately, had to be scrapped last year. We all know why. And so the turnout was similar to what the turnout was in the last census, but again, we're really hoping to improve that. Like in Wyandotte County, where I teach and where my students live, I had counted that if we had got close to a 100% turnout in the census, they could have gained as many as 2 state districts in Wyandotte County, and millions of dollars more in funding. So it could have made a huge impact, even just that one small area. And so we were, like I said, we were really hoping for a lot of improvement this time. The hard to reach communities tend to be those who are already less advantaged. And those are the communities where the lowest turnout was, again, this time.
Can I, if I can, Larry?
Yeah.
Yeah. First, let me apologize to the professor who I called Connie. I did hear part of her presentation and kept thanking, but I didn't catch your name. I thought it was most informative, and I appreciate it very much, as I did hear Cole's and then finally Connie's. So as was mentioned, the undercount in Wyandotte County and in other counties is tremendous. Part of that, when I say the undercount is tremendous, it's not a good thing. It's not a good thing because, of course, we all know the allocation of resources are based on what those numbers are. In fairness, we're not alone in that in Kansas, where there have been undercounts. And despite best efforts, I thought at the end of the census, the on again, off again deadline, or the date for when everything would come in was a source of great confusion to several people who had received their forms and then did respond. There still is the undermining of the privacy of the census, especially among some communities that are concerned about how it would affect their status. And we have a huge undercount, more so, despite many good efforts in counting our Latino population. I have a neighbor 3 doors away who said under no circumstances would their family be participating. And they probably have 7 people in their household. How many times that's replicated and what we do to address it, we don't know. How do we account for the undercount? Finally, Larry, you mentioned, I'm happy that the count and the legislature will adjust for where our prisons are and where our students are located throughout that. That was a decision that was made through legislation. I think by and large, we as progressives will benefit from the upholding of that, even though we have a couple of state prison facilities that will have a population. But I was glad to see that we do have that participation when we look especially of our larger universities and even some of our larger state prisons.
So the prisoners are counted where they're housed, and that increases the population there and the representation from that district, correct?
Exactly. And by and large, that's a good thing. Well, it's a good thing for progressives. The converse is true for a couple of the prisons, but I think it's some gain for progressives when we look at colleges and prisons and where the count will be based on where they're housed.
You know, I've been intrigued in the conversation here, and several of you have mentioned this notion of community interest and it being vague. Just sort of a theoretical question. if you either didn't have or were denied access to individuals' political affiliation, what information would you go out and seek and to draw districts? How would you go about doing it if you didn't know the politics?
Well, I think for me, I like the communities of interest. You really will see more about what the community is about, what ties them together. Um, you know, what are their issues and concerns on a legislative basis?
And what are some of those factors that you would be specifically looking for to tie them together?
Well, it could be anything. I'll just tell you what my community of interest is. I live in southern Johnson County, and there's major transportation issues with our with the intermodal. There's a lot of truck traffic, and they actually kind of bypass the way station that's close to our house, and so that our community needs to stay together. Um, to address the legislature and even the city of Olathe probably about truck traffic. And we actually successfully found a way to get a traffic stoplight at a major intersection because of that truck traffic.
Very good. Others of you have any specific comments about community of interest? I think I mean, it's a fascinating way to look at this.
Yeah, I'll jump in for just a sec. You know, I'm kind of stuck on the courts here, but you know, the federal court used this very particular language of viewing Johnson County and Wyandotte County as a socioeconomic unit, and I think that's really encompassing of the type of factors that are important in redistricting. Socioeconomic is really you know, an all-encompassing term of you know, this is how these folks live, this is how you know, their day-to-day lives are similar to each other, and socioeconomics, just such a broad term, but encompasses so much that I think makes redistricting really important.
The thing
Yeah,
that metropolitan Kansas City, a metropolitan area, and with all the various counties, and the same kind of thing playing out, it sounds like.
Larry, there's also 9 counties in southeast Kansas that consider themselves to be a community of interest because of their economics. And they were actually split in 2002, and in 2012 they actually it was cured. So
Okay.
you know, that's a community of interest there.
And
The others, go ahead.
and I certainly hope that sometimes it's not necessarily a community of interest, but for one time, Wyandotte County used to be split. Wyandotte County was in 2 congressional districts. I think it was 30 years ago. It wasn't too long ago. It was in my lifetime, and so there's sometimes there are other factors, the north and south side of geographical boundaries, like a river or what have you, that people want to bridge them. Transportation was mentioned, looking at the flow of commerce and the economic stream in the area. I remember the fight to make Wyandotte County whole, because even though we were different, maybe different east, west, if you will, we still wanted to have one congressional member to whom we looked for the resolution of congressional matters.
I think I know the answer to the next question I would pose here, but how important is political affiliation in drawing these maps, and how, to what extent might it override those communities of interest?
I think the answer is party politics are too involved in redistricting. Finding ways to decrease that. You know, there so much of this refers to the Constitution, and whether it's the state constitution or the federal constitution, and clearly this isn't what the founding fathers intended for party politics to just run a process that's inherently fundamental to government. You know, my response to that is party politics are too involved with this particular process.
Should political affiliation, I know Professor Velasquez, when you were drawing your maps to show how districts might be drawn to favor one party over another party, is that party affiliation a good measure of fairness in redistricting? I mean, I can, for example, let's say there are no pockets of one party or another. You start with a neighborhood. My wife's a Republican and I'm a Democrat. My neighbor's wife is a Democrat and her husband's a Republican. And you get to the 50th or 100th one and hey, both of them are Republicans. And if that's the way the population was distributed across the state, it would be virtually impossible, even with a small minority of one party over there, to not have that one party dominate if everybody voted that way. So is it, when you start thinking about the political affiliation in that process, how important is that? And is it maybe a better measure of fairness? I know your graph that you showed earlier would suggest that, hey, you could get a little more vote for lesser population.
So just to make the distinction, I wasn't looking at affiliation, I was looking at voting records when I made those graphs. But well, the reality is we don't spread ourselves out like that.
Right.
We tend to pack ourselves into communities where, you know, we all know this, the urban areas, the progressives tend to pack themselves in there more, and the rural areas tend to be more conservative. And there's a whole lot of reasons for that. So I don't think we can separate our politics from everything else as if it's a completely separate beast. I mean, I think it's all intertwined. And so I think it's just one measure to look at that. Well, there's a whole lot behind that one measure. There's a lot that comes with that. And so I don't think it should be the only measure by any means, but I think it is one measure that should be looked at to see, hey, are some people drawing these maps intentionally to try to dilute some people's voices? And unfortunately, because partisan gerrymandering right now is legal, we see instances of states gerrymandering and they're using that as an excuse. And so they're saying, well, it's partisan gerrymandering. Well, you can look at it and clearly see, well, no, it's really not. It's you're diluting the voice of a racial minority. And they, well, no, we're just looking at political parties when we're drawing these maps. And so it's allowed them to get away with some things that maybe people shouldn't be getting away with.
How do you look at people who identify as independents and don't have a party affiliation? How do you think about them when you know where they live? You can certainly map that out. Every candidate has their walking maps that tell them, hey, knock on these doors, not these. These are most persuadable, etc. How do you look at the independents in this? And when you think about that voting power?
Well, yeah, I was looking at how people voted and not how they signed up. And so few people vote independent that it really didn't come into play in the numbers I was running.
Okay.
Because we're a two-party system for the most part.
Right.
If we had a different voting system, then everything would look a whole lot different.
Well, and you raise, I think, a fascinating question. I think Alaska just maybe this past election adopted a ranked choice voting system. Ranked choice voting system allows people, as I understand it, from both parties to run. It's an open primary. You narrow it down to maybe 5 candidates in the end. And then when the voters come to the polls, they have an opportunity to say, well, I would give this person number 1. That's my first choice. It's my second, third, fourth, fifth. And when you have all those choices out there, then the votes start to get tallied. And then once you find out who's in 5th place, you drop them off and you allocate their second, third, and fourth place votes to the candidates that they voted for. And then you drop off the 4th, and finally you get to the last candidate, who may not have been the first choice of everybody, but probably represents the population a little better. If we had that kind of system here in Kansas, how do you think this would affect drawing maps every 10 years?
So there's a whole lot of different ranked choice voting systems out there. The one that you just talked about is one method. And this is another topic that mathematicians love to argue over, on which ranked choice voting system is the best system, because there's the way people vote, which is you rank them, and then there's the way it's counted, which is a whole different beast. On do you drop the last place, or you drop the person that got the least first place votes? How do you, there's a whole lot of different systems. And I have one that I prefer that I won't go into because then I could talk all night, because I think it works out best mathematically. But anyway, how would that change the maps? I think the maps would be fairer. I think the voting would be fair. I think the representation would be fair, because right now with our plurality voting, we have what's called exaggerated vote. So people vote for a candidate. It might not be the candidate they really prefer, but they know the candidate they really prefer is not going to win. And so you have this, and especially in primaries, this can happen. Imagine a primary field where you have 10 different candidates, and 80% of the people will prefer any one of these 9 over here. And then you have this 1/10 outlier. Well, the 9 split up that 70% of the vote. 30% of the people really want this 10th candidate. This 10th candidate ends up winning. Well, majority of people, that would have been their last choice. So
No, any system
really messes things up.
Yeah, any system can get manipulated. But I guess what you're saying is there are other voting systems that might indeed get public opinion closer in line with ultimate legislation than we have today in many instances.
And I think gerrymandering would be a lot more difficult if we had a better voting system.
Okay.
Totally possible too. The federal government leaves all that to the states. Totally reasonable to think that could be in our future one day.
I think one of you brought up, I don't recall at this point who, the notion of an outside commission. I know it's been talked about before. What do you think about that? Is it a good way to get things done? I mean, it seems fair if it's sort of independent of the legislature, but on the other side of it, it seems to me that it could be even more behind closed doors than what you see in the legislature.
Well, the nice thing about being behind the times in a state like Kansas is we let other states test out stuff like that for us. So you look around, and I think there are several different systems across the country. I look at Iowa. I like their system of their commission. But this is one of those things where you can really pull and pick what you like from other states that have been successful, where it works well, and then leave other parts that you may not like, picking what the commission looks like and really stealing that, if you will, from states that have been successful. But overall, yes, I think that would be, I think an independent commission would be a great thing.
What's on the news specifically that you like?
Just different ways that they select the members of the committee itself. Some of them are just party affiliation. Others are commissioned to elect the commission, kind of like the Kansas Supreme Court. You have 9 members who select a committee, and then the governor selects one person from that committee. That's the kind of system where you have multiple levels of selection, just increases the range of the public's input.
I think you would get a fairer representation. It wouldn't be, so much as favoring a political party or political candidate, or favoring an incumbent or a candidate.
I tend to agree a little bit, because we're in Kansas. It's not going to get much worse, frankly, than the districts that we have. And we would be able to look again or that commission would look at communities of interest, and would certainly have to defend the cohesion if they needed to. Of course, the courts are going to be a backdrop, but they would be able also to look at what a district looks like. It may have, we have some that have some very oddly shaped districts. I think a commission would look more towards something that stays within natural boundaries, counties, and communities of interest. And I think we would probably end up with a far better slice of representation than we have right now if we had a commission.
We've got a question from the audience. Did anybody else wish to comment on that? We have several good questions here that come in from the audience. And one's already been answered, but how long does the legislature have to be locked in indecision before it goes to court? And I think you kind of answered that earlier, but give us some time markers. When's kind of the drop dead time for the legislature? At the end of their next legislative session?
Yes.
Yes.
That's kind of what I gathered. Okay. Here's another hypothetical one at this point. Well, maybe not so. It depends on who has access to the numbers. How likely is Kansas to lose a congressional district? I know that's been, I think, Senator Haley, I think you mentioned that earlier.
We will, fortunately, the numbers, even though there's an undercount, will hold on. I believe that we will maintain our 4 congressional districts this year. I mean, so a decade out, if the trend continues, we will maybe go from 4 to 3 in 2020 from the 2030 census, but we should probably be grateful that we dodged the population decline bullet, not keeping up with the other parts of the country for the time being.
All right. Another question from the audience there is, how does demographic shifting, people moving more frequently, affect redistricting? I think I'm not exactly sure where they're going, but I think clearly people are moving more, which could affect both political affiliations changing in areas, and also after the district lines are drawn, the things get out of balance, and of course that's why we rebalance with the 10-year redistricting. Any comments on that?
Well, Johnson County has seen a population shift, so we'll probably see that population shift show up in the census. And so the lines will definitely be affected because of that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, one interesting phenomenon of rapid increases of population is, in this case, Republicans who have the supermajority, they can essentially gerrymander themselves out of their own seat to pick up seats elsewhere, kind of reverse gerrymandering, dropping your own district in order to reshape the entire area that's picked up population, and that's kind of a reverse gerrymander, but does the same thing to overall increase a certain party's representation at the Capitol.
Another good audience question in here: should communities of interest be consistently recognized or identified or used across the state for court review? I know each of you've talked a bit about some different things that identify as community of interest. Should there be something?
Yeah. Hello. Hello.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, they have to be. Yeah, and that's one of the universal court-approved dictates of redistricting, is that community of interests are one of the bases of consideration for districts to be drawn.
Any other comments on that? I know which legislature this time will be on the redistricting committee.
I think you were asking about, do we know who will be on the redistricting committee?
Right.
The House has selected their redistricting committee, but the Senate hasn't.
The Senate has not as of yet.
Yeah, and one area to keep an eye on is the House chair. I know he has expressed interest in running for federal seat. He's drawing the maps out of a state committee. Sort of a conflict of interest there. in my opinion, a very large conflict of interest. But
Yeah.
nonetheless, an interesting item to keep your eye on. Chris Croft is chairing a committee where he is drawing maps for a federal district he intends to run for.
Yes. I
Um,
concur.
Who rules on the congressional districts? We've been talking about state legislative districts. Who rules on the congressional districts? The question from the audience.
Well, if it's believed to be a partisan gerrymander, the U.S. Supreme Court decision of 2019 leaves that to the states. That is no longer an issue federal courts can rule on. And in the state of Kansas, partisan gerrymandering is legal. So you're limited as far as where, if it is a partisan gerrymander, you're limited as to where that ruling is going to be held. Racial gerrymandering still occurs, communities of interest, et cetera, can still go to federal court. So it really depends on what form of gerrymandering is taking place, if it's a legal issue, what the suit mentions and what kind of court it will end up in.
Another related or question back to the communities of interest, which seems to be drawing a lot of interest from our listeners, is how can we find out about what communities of interest are identified in our district? And I would probably add to that and say, let's say 10 years ago, Connie, somebody came in and said, here are my, here are the arguments for the cohesiveness in this. It's transportation, let's say out in your area with the rail center. Is that something that has become a de facto community of interest at that point? Or let's say that all those problems are solved and some other problem comes up that might cause you to think about those district boundaries differently. Is there any kind of steadfastness to these communities of interest that are identified?
Not necessarily. I mean, I look at my community. I could probably be in 3 or 4 communities of interest where I live. And a district could have multiple communities of interest. It's where are you located? There's a way to determine what your community of interest is. I mean, it's where you live, where you work, where you seek medical attention, a hospital or what. I grocery shop in an entirely different district. So I'm not included in that district, even though I grocery shop in that district. So
this next question takes us off into just a little bit different venue, but how are municipal districts for city council, county board positions determined? And if local districts are contested, do they go through the same court appeal process that congressional districts would go through?
Oh gosh, I don't know the answer to that.
I don't know
I
either.
don't know either.
Well, I do know that normally local districts, a county commission or the city council are drawn. It's a local. We don't do it at, of course, the state level. So I don't know who exactly does, but of course it's confined within the area where it is. But I think that the legislative bodies adopt their own or draw their own maps, probably go through a similar process. I don't know who affirms or denies them though.
Yeah, and it certainly isn't governed by the Kansas Constitution like state House and state Senate redistricting is. That is a good question that I do not know the answer to.
Yeah, I think it would depend on like the county charter or the whatever that is at the county level or a city charter.
I'd make the same assumption, but I thought it was a good question. We talk about the state legislature and the
Real good question. Yeah.
Real good, yeah.
Another question just came in here. If we believe it is a conflict of interest for Chris Croft to be drawing maps for a congressional race he may be running in, is there someone we should be writing to, et cetera, to voice our opinion?
I'm going to tell you to write your legislator.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we remember Chris Kobach, Secretary of State, running for governor. And there was some concerns then that he's the one counting the votes in the gubernatorial race. And these conflicts come up every once in a while. And I was just trying to think what happens when what's so obvious, obviously a conflict, how we responded to who we did right, you know, writing a legislator or media scrutiny. I don't know.
Yeah, write a letter to the editor.
I think there's also a unique conflict of interest in this case because his particular party has already gone on the record. That particular district is of interest. Then that said party appointed him to be the chairman of drawing the very district that they have singled out. And he also happens to be running for that district. There's just a handful of factors that really start to build up a case of concern, and also potentially some legal precedent where there could be, you know, I don't know if there's state precedent or federal case law that is actually inherent to something like this, but there's a lot of factors that really start to make you scratch your head with this whole situation.
You know, one of the themes that seems to have run through the evening, and various members of the panel here have touched on it, is sunshine seems to be a pretty good treatment for some of this, just to get it out there so people can see it. You go into public and you write a letter, you show up at a meeting, you participate and make your voice and your presence heard. That seems to be a great means of approaching this. Anybody else have any other suggestions? It's a pretty remote process. I mean, it's not something we're right up against each and every day. We do this once every 10 years and it's kind of behind us, but yet, you know, it's one of the critical pieces to furthering our democracy and making our legislative processes more responsive to the citizens themselves.
I'll jump in on this question. What district is Chris Croft in? He is House 8. It's like 119th in Schweitzer down to 151st in Schweitzer on the west side of the road, I believe. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Do any of you panelists have questions of the other panelists? We're just nearing the very end of our time here this evening. Well, I would like to take the opportunity to thank each of you for spending an hour and a half of a beautiful evening here with us and sharing your thoughts on redistricting and how we make our democratic processes more responsive. And with that, I will turn it back over to Michael Popa if he's still here.
Hello, I am still here. And I would like to echo Larry's sentiment. Thank you so much to our wonderful guests this evening for giving your time and your expertise. And to Larry for keeping the conversation going. You've all given us a lot to think about. And I know personally, I learned a lot this evening. I am going to right now drop a link into chat. It's a really brief survey. Okay. Just take a moment to let us know your thoughts about tonight's event and maybe what topics you'd like to hear about in the future. And with that, I'd like to thank our members and donors, over 120 whom registered for tonight's event. Without your support, Mainstream Coalition and our affiliate, the Voter Network, would not be able to do the work that we do. Next month, we will be hosting a discussion about what we've learned this past year in public education, from the effects of the pandemic on students and teachers to the incredible work undertaken by our schools. We'll also discuss some of the legislative actions taken during the year. That event will also be member only, so please be on the lookout for more details coming soon, and make sure to tell your friends to become members at mainstreamcoalition.org. Help us to keep Kansas moving forward. Again, there's a link in chat. Please take a moment to fill out that brief survey. Thank you again for joining us this evening. Stay safe, and please remember to do more than vote with Mainstream.